This morning I hope to talk a little bit about some of my studies on outreach to Muslims. And you might say, well, that's a little different topic. How do you come to that kind of a study? Well, this morning, Lambert, en route from Mukhanyo to here, he said, so how did you get to Africa? And we took the whole trip, to explain how the Lord brought us to Africa. And I said, you know, if I look at our lives, we've just sort of hung on for the ride. It's not like we have made or planned this at all. I have a background in environmental biology, horticulture, actually a Bachelor of Science in agriculture. And so how does a guy with a Bachelor of Science in agriculture stand before you today? We've sometimes wondered, how is it that God has coordinated this crazy ride that we've been on? Long story short, we moved to Guinea, West Africa in the year 2000. Guinea, West Africa is, we had to learn where it even was. Where is Guinea? What language do they speak? And it turned out that they were French speaking, which was very great because our children were raised in French schools. So they could go to the local school. That also meant they could have local friends. So we had many boys, because we have 3 boys, many boys who would jump on our trampoline of Muslim background. And so it became, we just lived in the community, and we started to learn how they actually think. You know, if you take a course on Islamics, of course, you'll know there's this many pillars, and there's this many of this, and this many of that. But that doesn't really get you under the skin of how a Muslim thinks. Muslims generally, even for all of their bravado, are actually very paranoid. Very, very paranoid. One day, we asked our worker, Jallo, Jallo, your relative has passed away. What happens now in your religion? And he said, John, it's the Guinea games. So you have a lotto here, a lottery in this country. What do you call it? Lottery? Lottery something? Lottery, okay. Yeah, okay. So he says, John, it's the Guinea games. That's the national lottery. He said, some win, some lose. All we can do is buy more tickets to hedge our bets. He has just given me a window into his Islamic worldview. Some win, some lose. All we can do is buy more tickets to hedge our bets. And of course, he's talking about this striving, which is fundamental to Islam. Striving in the way of Allah could be a summary of what Islam is. You strive to do this, you strive to do that. Always, perhaps, this non-covenantal deity of theirs, who can wake up anytime with a bad headache and crush you under his feet, they live with that paranoia. And yet there's a huge amount of bravado, because, you know, we live in Rustenburg, and now the man who owns our local Midas auto shop, he doesn't have children. What's he going to do to leave a legacy? He's building a massive mosque right behind the Rustenburg Mall. And they'll probably, they say, oh, we're not going to use the minaret for the call to prayer, but trust me, they will. And in that call to prayer, you have a very supremacist religion. The call to prayer basically says, come to prayer, come to success. God, Allah of Islam, is greater than anyone. Allahu Akbar. It doesn't just mean that Allah is great. It means He is greater. So what does that say to us as Christians? When they say Allah is greater than, they're actually saying He is greater than your God, you Christians. And, of course, the prayer invokes people to make their religion very much a center of their life. And, of course, that prayer, that call to prayer comes out every morning. We lived in Egypt. We had moved from Guinea after 11 years to Egypt. And Kaïro is the concrete jungle. And in that concrete jungle, you have mosques that compete with their loud. I tell you, I was here in Kimberley, and I hear we're across the big hole, and I hear this call to prayer. I go, what is it? I'm waking up. I go, am I in Egypt? It just gives me a headache. And you know, that Islamist, that supremacist, it just so in the face of Christians. Every mosque in Egypt is taller than a church. It says, the architecture says, we are better than you. The religion says that. So how do we as Christians respond? How do we reach out to Muslims? I'd like to propose that there have been two strains of thought. Demonize Islam, demonize all Muslims, or sanctify Islam and sanctify all Muslims. Neither of those is actually helpful. I would prefer that we would actually see Islam as, I would say, a demonically inspired religion, and Muslims as people who are lost without Christ. See? So that way we don't demonize this Muslim who's in front of us. That has been a fundamental mistake, to demonize Muslims. Because as we lived around them, and in Guinea we lived around them. We did not live in a missionary compound. Obviously, because of security, we had to have a walled house and gate and so on. But they would come to our house. They would say, oh, could you pray a blessing on this new married couple? We're having a party. So we'd be invited to the party. Now, how do you pray a blessing for a Muslim couple as a Christian? How do you do that? You ever thought about that? This is a bit of a stretch. Like, these are not Christians, but yet we want them to be, and yet we want to pray a blessing that's bona fide and not some kind of sham. Well, I'll leave it with you to think about how I might have prayed a blessing on that couple. But my hint is that they would be led to know their true Jesus. Because we weren't afraid of mentioning the true Jesus. Because, of course, there is the Muslim Jesus, right? Isa al-Masih, which is kind of a fiction. He's kind of a superhero. It's the Aryan heresy all over again. So as we lived there, we rubbed shoulders with them a lot. And what I did, in order to get to understand Muslims, I actually read through all of the hadiths. Now, the hadiths are reports on what Muhammad said or did. A lot of them are fictitious. But it gives you a window into their life. You see, in Acts 17, the Apostle Paul said, as I walked around your city, I made careful observation of the objects of your worship. And I believe that if the Lord puts on our hearts to reach a certain segment of our society with the gospel, we have to make careful observation of their worship. So I learned these hadiths. And you say, well, they're kind of fictitious, but yet it's close to the Muslim heart. And I also read the life, the seerah, the life of Muhammad. That is one gory book. It exalts all of his violence. 700 pages. But in order to reach Muslims, it's part of the deal. So one day, our worker, Amadou, he says to Madame, he says, I know that you guys pray to your God and your God answers prayers. And we go, how do you know that? I know that you pray to your God and your God answers prayers. We're just going, we're being watched. And he says, I have a relative who's sick. Can you come and pray for him? And Madame says, well, yeah, we could. Let's see what we can arrange. So we're driving over to his compound. He gets a call. we'll call him Mohammed for lack of a better name. Mohammed died. And we said, well, what do you want us to do, Amadou? Do you want us to get you a taxi fare to go to your relatives? He said, no, come along. Well, we get there, and as you know, in Africa, not all of death is not all sanctified, so you've got the body wrapped up outside, and here the women are outside of the compound, wailing, and there's a guy with a thorn bush thrashing these women. Don't cry, because what you're doing, if you're crying, you are actually going against Allah's judgment here, that he took him home. And you'll jeopardize his idea of getting into paradise, or his possibility of getting into paradise. And we're having another window into Islamic thinking. Then I get ushered in, and Anne sits at the back of this little mosque that they had at the compound. And I said, Anne, pray that the guy who comes to sit beside me will ask me a question. Because it's one thing to say, well, I'm going to tell you Muslims how wrong you are. It's another one for a Muslim to say, I need to know what you believe, and I need to know what's going on in you. It's another story. Because we can be a bit supremacist ourselves by being, how right we are. Because, sure, we have the true Jesus, right? Not the fake Muslim one. Guy comes and sits beside me. What happens in your religion when people die? Woo! What a question! What happens in your religion when people die? How would you answer that? I'll leave that with you. Long story short, I had just been reading the work of an evangelist named Ray Comfort. Ray Comfort was an evangelist from California. And he reflected on his ministry, and he said, I have come to realize that I have given the antidote or the medicine of Jesus to people who have no idea that they're sick. And I thought, I don't want to give him the medicine of Jesus without him knowing that he's sick. I'll make the story very short. Long story short, we had a conversation about who can make the heart of a man clean. Because according to one of their hadiths, if 30 or 40 people with a pure heart pray for the deceased, he'll go to paradise. Now what I did, I honed in on that idea of a pure heart and said, there's no human with a pure heart. Right? Now I had to do it kind of explaining it in terms of a parable. Because obviously the God of this world has blinded their eyes. And so just as Jesus did, he came around with parables. And I said to this man, make it your life's mission to figure out who can clean the heart of a man from the inside. And that was a lot of our theme in Guinea. As we were in Guinea, a new trend in outreach to Muslims erupted. It started mostly in Mali, and this was called the Insider Movement. The Insider Movement basically said, you can stay inside of your Muslim community even after you become a Christian. You can still say the Shahada, the Islamic confession of faith. You can still do your Islamic prayers, but you just kind of be a kind of underground chameleon Christian. And I started reading the writings of this movement. And I just go, this is bad news. Exegetically, they had their proof texts, just as every movement has its proof texts. You go to the prosperity gospel, right? There's Malachi. You go to this one, and there's 1 John, right? Well, they had their proof texts. So what I did, I set out to actually out-exegete their proof texts. There's a lot of work. And in Guinea, guess what? There's no theological libraries. And guess where you go for the internet? To the cyber cafe, if there's power. if there's an internet connection. So this just taught me dogged persistence, because I said, this is wrong. And so we need to just work against that. And these articles started to get published. And I got a bit of infamy with our mission organization. They said, you're just causing trouble here. I said, this is worth dying for, because if you say that one of these chameleon type of Christian Muslims, Chrislam, is actually going to be saved, you're on the wrong track. It's impossible. You cannot make a hybrid of these two. And so eventually, I was publishing a lot in a journal that was in Egypt called the St. Francis Magazine. And the editor helped me. Those were my junior days of writing, very junior. He helped me with a lot of stuff. And eventually, our mission organization said, you know, probably better that we're agnostic about this. We're not making a decision about it. It'll all work out. Nonsense. Things don't just all work out. You need to take a stand. And so eventually we moved to Egypt, and I joined the Alexandria School of Theology, which was an Anglican school, actually quite evangelical. And there I was the vice principal of the theological school. I kept writing about Islam, but I had to be careful in Egypt, of course, because to write an article called "Is Muhammad a Parody of Jesus Christ?" you can lose your head for that. So I was writing under a pseudonym for a while. And then due to the medical situation of our youngest son, we moved back to Canada. He had chronic migraine headaches. And we said, no, we need to leave. During that time in Canada, I decided that it was time to look at a method called the CAMEL method. CAMEL is an acronym for C for chosen, A for angels, M for miracles, EL for eternal life. And what this method did, which was a method developed in the United States, and Americans like to franchise things and like to send it worldwide, right? That's why you have McDonald's here. But they also do that missiologically. And they kind of used Bangladeshis as their guinea pigs, and they developed this method there, and then wrote glowing reports. Hundreds of thousands of Muslims come to the Lord. And what it was based on this. CAMEL, it actually is saying that in Surah, so Surah chapter equals chapter, Surah 3, 49 to 55, you can find the gospel in the Quran. And my red flags are going, wah, 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 this is garbage. You cannot find the gospel in the Quran. If I know anything about Islam from my years of living with Muslims, this is anti-gospel. And so, long story short, decided to to approach a theological school to see if I could actually do a PhD thesis on this. And through God's grace, an opportunity opened up in Aix-en-Provence in France for me to do my doctorate. But they said, you know, you did your original theological studies in the mid-'80s. We're not sure you have a brain anymore. So you're going to have to do a little bit of qualifying stuff. I said, well, you know, I've got these articles, peer-reviewed articles. Could that just stand in place for a lot of assignments? They said, sure. Okay. So long story short, I wrote my first, the THM, then in France, on the approach of the CAMEL method to the miracles of this Islamic Jesus. Because in the Quran, as you might know, there's a story that the Islamic Jesus turned these birds, clay birds, and made them fly. So it's actually it comes from an apocryphal story, and the Quran, and will be off the record, is actually a mismatch of a lot of traditions that were circulating in the area. And they just piled this one into the blender and press the blender and out comes the Quran. So I looked carefully at that story of the Islamic miracles. And part of that was to look at Islamic tafsir literature. So there's a technical term for interpretive literature in Islam. So if we want to find out what did Calvin say, what did Augustine say, etc., that's easy, right? We can find that. Well, they have their own body of literature, which is their scholars who've interpreted things. And what I came to realize is that every single one of these 30 major Islamic commentators said there is no way, shape, or form that you can assert deity to this Jesus because he happened to create these clay birds. That's the line of thinking of the camel method. Jesus, the Islamic Jesus, created these birds, so obviously he's the creator, and he made them fly, so he obviously can blow the breath of life into people, and these are only actions of God. Therefore, the Islamic Jesus is God. That's what the camel method said. Whereas all of the Islamic tafsir literature said not a chance. In fact, the first guy out of the gate, and their commentary literature works the same way a bit as ours, right? Augustine's or Calvin stands on Augustine's shoulders, someone else stands on Calvin's shoulders, someone else, and then we quote this whole line, don't we? Isn't that somehow we do that? Well, they do the same thing. They stand on the shoulders of the first guy. The first guy said, yeah, it was a magic trick. The Islamic Jesus, he used a magic trick to cause this bird to fly, but the moment it was out of sight, it dropped dead and fell back to earth. And what he's done, really, is to say there is no way, shape, or form that this could be a miracle. And so I basically charged the camel method in my master's thesis with saying, you have created a new body of tafsir literature, which is outside of Islamic tafsir literature. And that's illegal. Because you don't respect a religion if you kind of rewrite its terms on your terms, right? They were kind of Christianizing everything. And so that didn't get me a lot of good press with the founders of the camel method. And then, of course, I post it to Academia EDU, and then it gets reads, all kinds of reads from all over the world. Dangerous business. I'm still alive. And then decided, yeah, let's do the PhD on this. So, yeah. 7 minutes? Okay, perfect. So then I decided to look at, is this idea of Christianizing the Quran, has that ever happened anywhere in history? Right? Because the camel method basically said, you know, we looked at Muslims in Bangladesh, and yep, they were using the Quran, and they were bringing their brother Muhammad or brother Abdullah to faith. And I said, I wonder if this has happened in history. And actually, so I looked at, in my PhD thesis, I looked at the history of Christianizing the Quran and found about 9 major players, including someone like Kenneth Craig, someone like Zahner, a fellow named Perinder, a guy named Paul of Antioch. And I looked at the common themes that linked them all together. And what I saw is that they were actually, you could call it almost like some kind of eisegesis, kind of saying, this is what you Muslims are saying, whereas that's not what they were saying. That was a common theme. And I also linked it into some common themes. So are some of you were aware of the word preparatio evangelica? Yeah, preparation for the gospel. Well, some of these writers were saying that the Quran is a preparation for the gospel. And I'm just going, how do you figure that out? But then you look back and you say, okay, I can see they have this agenda, such a strong agenda to kind of force Christianity into Islamic thinking. Then I also looked at another aspect. How is it that, and you see, this was a very hybrid thesis. How is it that the regenerate man comes to know truth, and how does the unregenerate man maybe not come to know truth? Because if you are saying the unregenerate Muslim, by adding a little bit of information, can actually apprehend Christian truth, this is a huge idea in terms of systematic theology and of a reform view of what is it that the unregenerate man is like. Right? We believe in the noetic effects of sin. And how can the unregenerate man say, yes, I decide for Jesus when he's dead? So that was another part of my doctoral thesis, to look at the theological presuppositions behind the thinking of the Camel method. And that, yeah, it's available on Academia EDU. It's a short 400-page read. Because I was breaking new ground, because no one had ever critiqued this method. You see, my passion for writing this doctoral thesis was not because I would be called doctor. I was 62 already when I graduated, and I said, you know, the amount I'm going to move the needle theologically in this world is like, I'm minuscule. I'm not 26 when I believe I'm going to move the needle this much. Maybe some of you are 26. And so that's kind of how I got to this point in my life, having written this thesis. And I said, I need this to get into the literature. And my prof was very, very wise. He said, you know, John, you're breaking new ground. And when you break new ground, a sniper can just come, boom, and shoot his bullet into the bottom of your hull, and the whole thing will collapse. You better really make a very, very strong case. So thanks be to God, I had a very good prof. The jury, when they grilled me. It was more of a hazing than anything. I think to get into this club, you got to go through that. So I'm here, and we have a few minutes, and I wonder if you have any questions, comments.
We have 2 minutes.
Yeah, fine. Lots of time. We're in Africa. You notice I don't wear a watch, right? Yeah.
Perhaps just sum up for us in which way you should go. Is it using these windows that you have with them, or you told us how not to do it? And
yeah.
The windows, so
yeah.
Actually, what is the basis?
Sure. My personal view of outreach to Muslims follows Acts 17. The Apostle Paul, he has a paroxysm about the idolatry in Athens. Yet he says, men of Athens. That is to say, he should have said, you scumbag idolaters of Athens. No, he says, men of Athens. And then they insult him. You're just a bird-brained seed picker. He doesn't respond with insult. He kindly says, yeah, let's talk. He moves slowly from their worldview. Of course, this is not a Jewish worldview in Athens. He's got the worldview of the Epicureans and the Stoics in front of him. So he has to address them. He has to do a mental switch, right? Because normally he's addressing Jewish people in synagogues. And so he builds from creation. He builds from providence. He builds to last judgment. And you know how the story ends. Some believed, some scoffed, some said, we want to know more. And often with Muslims, that's how it works. Some believe, some scoff, some say, we want to know more. That's in a nutshell my answer. Yeah.
I was wondering also that Abraham Kuyper, in his book on Islam, he said two things. On the one hand, he said it's a false religion. On the other hand, he talked about a possibility of using them as co-belligerents against secularism.
Right.
Just give your thoughts quickly on that.
Right. Actually, that's something that you say that. I wrote an article on Abraham Kuyper and Islam for the Hampshire Theological Journal. And yes, they, for instance, we come from Canada, and our government is extremely secular. And could you align with a Muslim to say, this law that you're proposing about euthanasia is just garbage? I don't think you're not making a deal with the devil. I just say human life is valuable and we should fight for it. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Dr. Span, just a small token to say thank you very much.
And this is her-interpretasie.
South Africa. A little
this
bit
is lekker.
Bolton.
You see that? I used my one Afrikaans word. Thank you.
Very... and one of the wonderful signs that we saw at the back is your wife is still laughing at your jokes.
Nah.
That is the ultimate sign that you're a successful missionary. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you much. Yeah. Thank you.